Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the SAME Energy and Sustainability webinar titled Resilient Facility Control Systems, a Practical Approach to Cybersecurity. My name is Tamal Harbison, and I am with the SAME National Team, and I will be assisting in the background with any technical issues you might experience today. Before we get started, I would like to go over a couple of housekeeping notes. You have entered the platform in a listen-only mode, but we ask that you double-check your microphones to make sure that they are muted. During the presentation, you can submit all your questions in the Q&A function next to the chat tab, and we will get to those at the end of the presentation. In the handout section, you can download today's presentation and PDH certificate. This webinar will be recorded to be viewed at a later date on the SAME Energy and Sustainability COI webpage. Without further ado, I would like to turn it over for our moderator today, Michelle Exros, site. You now have the floor.
Great, thank you, Tamal. I'm really excited this morning or this afternoon to introduce our guest speaker to you. His name is Daniel Shepard. He's the IT specialist in the Energy Branch Facilities Division of the U.S. Army's Engineer Research and Development Center, Construction Engineering and Research Laboratory of the Engineer Research and Development Center in Champaign, Illinois, and that is quite a mouthful. His current work is aimed at supporting CERL's initiatives in research and development efforts for the facility-related control systems. And his primary focus is applying the cybersecurity measures to properly cybersecure facility-related control systems as a contributing author of the UFC 401016, as well as the guide specification 250511, which we are speaking on today. Prior to his work at CERL, Daniel spent several years as a technical director of Control System Cybersecurity Mandatory Center of Expertise in the Engineering Directorate of the Engineering and Support Center in Huntsville, Alabama. And we're very excited to have him with us today. We will be looking at the Q&A throughout today as well. And Daniel, I'm going to turn it over to you. And we're going to kick it off with a couple poll questions here first. Thanks.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. And really appreciate this opportunity to speak to you on a topic that's kind of near and dear to my heart, and I'm sure it is to you as well as you execute projects. So trying to today to maybe dispel some fact from fiction and myth and maybe some urban legends about the criteria and the specification, and hopefully everyone will walk away today with a little bit better understanding of it in a general sense. Even though this is an hour-long topic, we can't get too far down in the weeds, but I definitely want to try to give some tips for success from an industry and a government perspective, both alike, but coming at it from a different lens, of course. So we had a poll question that came up, and just to find out where you're coming from. So that's really good, just to know where you're from. And the second one that we have is, what do you do within your organization? And this is really going to help us to understand like our audience, so that we can, be able to target our presentation material in a more effective manner. It's good to know where people, what their walk of life is as they're receiving this material, and it gives you a better perspective to say, oh man, we were, I was off base in presenting this content, because we're talking to project managers more than we are architects or engineers, or we're talking to a group of IT professionals who may not really want to know much about project management. So it really helps us into refining our material and getting it in a better format. So if you could take time to please answer those poll questions.
Okay, so Daniel, so we have about, we have a lot of large business on the phone today, 56%, and then small business, and then government agencies. So that's kind of the breakdown there. And then we have quite a bit of architects and engineers on the line with us today, and then program and project managers, and then the IT cybersecurity professionals. So pretty much as you outlined your poll is the
Great.
order of precedence.
Great, and that's good. So my assumptions or presumptions were quite accurate from an order of precedence. So that's win one for me. There we go. All right, let's get into it. So today we're going to be going over kind of a generalistic overview of the criteria and the specification that Michelle opened up with, and really want to talk about its background, how it came to be, again, like I said, maybe go into kind of scope and purpose, and maybe touch base on some of the misconceptions that a lot of folks that we've seen, that I've seen personally in execution of projects, seem to think that the UFC does this and the UFGS does that, maybe a little bit out of line. And once those kind of intent and scope are clarified, then the light bulb goes off and people are like, oh, okay, well, it makes it a little bit easier to navigate, because cybersecurity in itself can be a very nebulous topic. It has a lot of stakeholder involvement, and so kind of understanding who kind of pushes the buttons and responsibility of parties is really critically important, I think, more so than in some cases just the technical execution. I think that's where there's a lot of roadblocks for success. So we definitely want to I want to present some tips for success that I think that are important for any project team from the government and industry alike. And then look at it from how do we approach cybersecurity from an IT perspective, and then non-IT approaches to address cybersecurity. And I think that's a pretty good agenda for an hour. And I'm sure there's going to be a lot of questions that I may not cover in terms of content. You know, you're probably got some targeted questions that may not be captured in the content. So please, you know, send those questions and we'll try to address them to the best of our ability and get you some clarity. So UFC 41006, Cybersecurity of Facility-Related Control Systems, you know, the scope and intent of that is to really support the risk management framework execution, but it's targeted for a really narrow focus in terms of it's design focused. So it's not an O&M guide for execution of RMF from a system owner perspective. When I say RMF, the risk management framework. So there's a lot of you know, thoughts on that of like, well, this is kind of like a how to do RMF. Well, it is kind of in some essence, and the reason for that is this is the first criteria within the DoD and building code perspective that addresses cybersecurity. I know there were a lot of other criteria and some other guide specifications that may had a section embedded within them that address cybersecurity, but it was very thin in nature. For example, it would just say execute DIACAP, the old predecessor to RMF, or coordinate with the site to address cybersecurity concerns. And that would be the depth of a requirement within the criteria and specifications. So the DoD recognized that these systems are getting, facility-related control systems are becoming more and more intelligent. They're becoming more and more interconnected. We're using those in the field to drive business decisions, not only where we're investing, we're getting data out of them to look at how efficient we're operating the facility envelope. So they've become a little bit more, not just keeping the building operable and comfortable from, you know, an occupancy standard, but they're also taking that data and doing analytics on it to find out how do we, you know, how's the performance of this building? Do we need new equipment? You know, what are our occupancy loads? So a lot of that data can be used to do other things. So with all that being said, a lot of that's communicating over a network, both a IP network and then a control side network. And so, you know, risk for vulnerability is at an all-time high as systems become more and more interconnected. So the DoD said we need to have building code to address cybersecurity in the systems that we're placing into these facilities. So it was originally published in 2016 of September. That was the first, you know, edition, so to speak, first revision of the UFC. There was a lot of struggle with that. It took a 2-year development period to kind of to get the UFC published. And the reason why that is there's a lot of different input, right? We have Navy, Air Force, Army, we have a tri-service community that are providing input to this, and we have to make it relative enough for any one of those services and agencies and how they execute or you know, perform projects. We have to make it agnostic enough to where it'll fit for any service. That's the point of having a unified facility criteria. So cybersecurity and how it's executed and the services are all done a little bit different way. We all follow a same set of standards, but we execute it in various flavors, so to speak. There's nuances to the process. And so getting everyone on the same sheet of music was a challenge. It was a really difficult effort. And I think we came out with a good product. Now the bad side of that was when we released it, we didn't have a corresponding guide specification that married up with it. That didn't come out to another year later. So we had this design criteria. It's a core UFC. So everybody's trying to accommodate this into projects, and then the domino effect of, well, we didn't plan and program for this into the scope of these projects. So that gets into a lot of project management aspects that I don't think I'm going to be tackling here. But it's been a challenge to integrate this into the paradigm of how we design and construct facilities. And I know industry and government alike are struggling with it to some degree because it's new. I mean, it really is. It's a new requirement. And with anything new, there's always growing pains. So another good thing, it was revised in 2017, and we're already in 2021, and we have a new revision to it that's soon to be published in May. So again, it's going to have some changes to it. It's getting more refined. It's getting more targeted. And hopefully, eventually, I think a lot of the how-to and the history of what cybersecurity is and how you do the theoretical principles of cybersecurity will eventually start to contract, and we'll have more targeted design criteria versus an education. This UFC, if you've read it, is probably vastly different from many other UFCs in terms of like how it's written. It is really written from an educational stance and not very targeted like other UFCs. Like if you looked at the structural UFC or you name it, you plug in a UFC that's just really straight and to the point. This one has a kind of an educational academia type background to it, and it's just to get people educated on the topic because there is a lack of knowledge at the time of publishing. But again, it is a very narrow focus. It is guidance to designers of records, and it requires information from the designer record. It is not an RMF execution manual, even though there's a lot of talk about risk management framework in it. It is not what the system owner needs to do to conform or comply with RMF. This is strictly focused on the design side, what a designer of record needs to address in the development of project specifications. Okay, it gives general guidance for low and moderate impact systems. So a system that has a low impact and a moderate impact, there's going to be a lot of guidance in that of how to address that from a design side. But for high systems, since those are few and far between, and they are going to have unique characteristics or system performance parameters for a high impact type system, in a UFC, we can't just do that in a generalistic manner. They're going to need targeted, detailed design guidance. I think you can use this as a foundation to build upon to get you on a path to success, but it would be very difficult for us to take into every situation in a generalistic nature to address high. So that's why we did not address high impact systems in the UFC. UFGS 250511, Cybersecurity of Facility-Related Control Systems. That, again, like I said, came along a year later in November of 2017, and it only covered low impact FRCS. So there's kind of an ugly situation with the specification. UFC covered low and moderate, so we had a delta. We didn't have a guide specification. We had criteria, but no project specification standard that was out there. And then when it finally came out, it only covered low impact systems. So then if you had a moderate system, you were having to do a lot of self-performance to address moderate in the spec. So that's been a challenge. It really has. We've been working on the updates to moderate for about a year and a half. It was a comprehensive, heavy lift, and going into COVID didn't help matters either. So that kind of delayed us. in terms of just contracting to get an additional tech support to help us write it. But come May, there will be a new publication, a revision to the UFC or UFGS and UFC. But this UFGS will cover moderate impact systems. It's going to have more tailoring options that cover lighting, fire alarm, and suppression. And there's going to be refinement to existing tailoring options that were already incorporated for HVAC and electronic security systems. We also covered down and added some more clarity into the other control systems category, which was included in the initial release. And we really went back in and added some more clarifications based upon feedback that we've received from the field, especially in the designer notes. There's a lot of lengthy designer notes in the UFGS. So we went back and really tried to provide additional clarity to that. And the outcome of that additional clarity was really getting into giving more granular definition of components. Like what we went in and defined what is a controller, what is a computer, and provided distinct definitions for those types of components within a control system. So the big takeaway from that is the direction or the instructions or definitions that are included in the UFGS are really, really important to have a clarity and understanding of how it's defined. You know, even to the point of like what a user interface is and the different types of user interfaces. What I mean, is it a remote user interface? Is it a local user interface? We put a lot of intent behind those definitions and how they fit into the mix of the design, because there's going to be explicit things that have to occur if you have, you know, X type of user interface versus Y type of user interface. And so how that all fits into the mix is really important to understand. So a lot of the, I guess, growing pains with this guide specification, that when we get questions from industry or the government alike that funnel back through channels, it's, well, what does this mean? And then when you go through and explain, well, the computer is here by this definition, then people go, oh, well, I get that. So I think a lot of folks are just diving into it and building project specifications prior to even reading it or understanding the content. And I get it. And a lot of that is time. You have a time constraint. You've got to get project specifications out. You know, we're all resource constraint and time constraint. So it's hard to take and read a 250-page UFC and then go through and marry that up with a UFGS and understand every nook and cranny. That's a difficult ask. But I would highly, highly, highly suggest that, you know, reading and understanding the intent behind the definitions and those designer notes are a must. So the last bullet there, I mean, it includes requirements in support of the risk management framework. Again, it is not full-blown RMF. If you execute the requirements and deliver submittals as required in the UFGS as you build out your project specifications, you're not doing 100% of risk management framework. They're not synonymous with each other. They're aligned to each other for sure, and the submittals that come out of it are aligned to support the risk management framework process, but they are not one and the same. And we'll go a little bit further into detail with that in the following slides. So here are some of those misconceptions. And originally, when I put this slide together, I wanted to put out in parentheses, you know, fact or fiction. And then I thought, oh my gosh, if people see this and haven't read the intent behind it, they're going to take this as an imperative, like designer records are not responsible for the full execution of RMF. And it's going to be a imperative statement. So there is some truth to this, though, these statements. Designers of record are not responsible for the full execution of RMF. So a lot of the projects that we get we'll see, the designer of record so focused on getting an ATO, and that's not their job, really, quite frankly. Do work products that come out of their design effort or instructions or specifications to a general contractor and their associated subs support it? Absolutely. They go hand in glove. So the designer is specifying technical requirements through the project specifications that the general contractor and or subs or if it's self-performed by the government, that will be executed against, right? That's what they're going to install into a building, and that's how they're going to secure it based upon what the project specifications say. However, that's, again, as I said previously, that's not full RMF. Some of those submittals absolutely support a system owner, or we'll use it in an industry term, it will support the building owner in obtaining their cybersecurity compliance. So there is some intent behind that. We do put a separation, so to speak, of church and state in relation to execution of full RMF versus execution of a project specification. Another misconception is that the designer of record assigns the impact rating to the FRCS, the Facility-Related Control Systems, within the scope of their associated projects. That is not the case. The assignment of an impact rating is critical to the designer of record because that sets the baseline for which the designer of record needs to specify certain elements of the project, but that is a defined requirement of the system owner. So this is where it gets kind of challenging in terms of blending or blurring those processes and procedures of the RMF into the execution of developing a specification. There is some, if you put it up in a Venn diagram, there is some overlap between those two processes. But ultimately, that, from a roles and responsibility aspect, is the responsibility of the system owner. And so when we say system owner or building owner or whoever is defined as the primary fiduciary and risk owner for that system, and that kind of gets into another rabbit hole of defining roles and responsibilities, they're the ones that assign that impact through their authorization official who finally confers that. So that's that RMF chain of command. The designer of record can definitely provide input to assist the system owner and the AO based upon their technical expertise and understanding what that facility and how the systems within that facility are supposed to operate and sustain the mission of that facility. So in the design narrative, I mean, if it's a hospital, let's just use a good example. If it's a hospital that has critical care and a lot of critical mission type elements, the designer of record could provide input to that system owner to say, well, we have a very, very robust HVAC system in this hospital. There's redundancy. There's a lot of resiliency built in just based upon the nature of the facility environment and the mission it's going to support. We feel that by doing X, Y, or Z, we could lower the impact, or we think it needs to be a higher impact. So they can provide input, but ultimately that decision does not rest on the designer of record. That is a government requirement that should be stipulated down as a user requirement to the DOR so that they can build out their specifications. Okay. Next bullet, general contractors and associated mechanical, electric, plumbing subcontractors are required to manage EMAS or for FRCS. And that should say not for, but for which they are installing as a part of a construction project. That is getting into the execution of RMF, and that is a system owner requirement. So the GC is not responsible for doing administrative aspects of the RMF. They're responsible for executing the project specifications from a contractual stance. So they are obligated to provide the submittals as specified in the spec, not necessarily to execute RMF. Now, I'm going to caveat that with there are certain specifications and certain services where the Navy has a specification, and I don't want to misquote it, but it's 250508 or 250811.0022, I believe, where it's a Navy only spec, and it talks about execution of RMF as a supporting ancillary task follow-on as a part of their project. So Navy projects, they have a separate spec that addresses like follow-on RMF activity support. So I caveat that with, if there is that spec, or if there's another ancillary support contractual requirement written into a project, that could change. But at native baseline, if you're executing 250511, the requirements in that specification are it. And there's no mention of EMAS in that specification, so that is really not a requirement. So clarity in that in contractual language is really, really important, but it's never been the intent of the designer record and the general construction community to execute RMF for the system owner. That is a pure system owner requirement. If there are additional contractual requirements where they need additional support to help execute that, then make sure that there is a clear delineation of those roles and responsibilities in your contracting efforts. Another misnomer, general contractors are required to obtain the ATO. Again, that is, an inherent government function assigned to government officials who authorize these systems. So the general contractor cannot bestow an ATO upon a system in which they're installing. That is a clear inherent government role. So it's there's a lot of confusion into that, especially on the GC side. I've got to get an ATO. Well, you're codependent upon the government supporting that and executing it. Your work products will help enable them to be able to do that, but never will a general contractor be able to achieve the ATO. So I think there's a lot of misconception in terms of language, of how that's interpreted, but clearly the only individual who is authorized to bestow an ATO upon a system is the authorization official within that organization's chain of command. Rmf artifacts, so these are more organizational plans, policy, procedures, are a focused deliverable of the design phase. No, you wouldn't want a designer record to write an organizational password use policy for the entire, Army Material Command, for example. So that's not an intent of the UFC to write RMF artifacts. Again, when you take the design requirements that come out of the UFC and start navigating and executing and developing project specifications off of UFGS 250511, there is no requirement to do organizational plans, policies, and procedures. System level input to plans, policies, and procedures, yes, those could be correlated to some of the construction submittals. But ultimately, those organizational plans, policies, and procedures in totality of the risk management framework process or package are incumbent of the system owner to provide. And of course, if you have a system owner that's competent and relevant to how to execute the RMF, they're going to take what you've provided from a submittal aspect and intertwine that into their plans, policies, and procedures to support their RMF efforts. So there is a symbiotic relationship between the designer record community, the general contractor community, and the system owner. So there definitely is a relationship, but there is a line, a delineation of responsibility. So, when we see proposals come in and we see hours upon hours to do RMF artifact development on the design side, really, in reality, that's not even a part of the sequence of the project. So that tells me from the government side, I don't think the designer of record understands the requirements. So we have something wrong in our contract that's either A, not clear, or B, there's just a misconception here that we need to clarify. And that's really important to clarify those things so that the designer of record is not hedging, and in a general contractor downstream, they're not hedging risk and higher bids and proposals because of uncertainty. So being clear in the contract and the requirements are vitally important. And then the last one, and I hear this a lot in some project meetings, has been, if the UFGS is followed explicitly, the system will receive an ATO. Not ultimately. That's not just a bottom line statement. If you follow the UFGS and submittals are accurate and sound, and the way the spec stipulates how you configure and harden the components within the system and how it's documented, the confidence factor of being able for the system owner to achieve an ATO is exponentially increased as opposed to doing nothing. But that in itself, again, as we talked about earlier in one of these bullets in terms of plans, policies, and procedures, RMF is a deep and wide process. So it does take both sides of the equation, the system owner to do their fair share of their requirements, and then the byproduct of the designer specifications that have been turned over to the general contractor community and install community, as they install and document and turn in and submit their submittals. That information and those work products will definitely put that system owner to a sound posture to achieve an ATO. But executing the requirements in a project specification in itself is not going to necessarily stipulate that you'll get an ATO. It's not a 100% guarantee, because there's other factors, managerial and non-technical factors, that the system owner has to do in totality to ensure that they receive an ATO. And that's how they're validated, through independent third-party assessment and validation for RMF.
Hi, Daniel.
Yes, go ahead.
Real quick, we had a question come in that I think it would be good to address now. It's just, what is your definition of the designer of record in relation to UFC 410.06?
The designer of record, in my interpretation, would be the folks or that community that is developing the project specification, or that it be an architecture engineering firm, industry, or if it's internal to the government that's doing the design. And I know that gets kind of cloudy in terms of the delivery method of the project, if it's design, bid, build, or design, build. But it would be that team in the community who are developing and building out project specifications to either perform internally within the government or externally with an architecture engineering firm, or the engineering firm that's providing design services, and splitting that out into the project delivery method. So if it's design, bid, build, or design, build, you're going to have different nuances, but that's how I would interpret the designer of record.
Thanks.
Does that help?
I think so. Elliot, if that didn't exactly answer your question, feel free to follow up with a follow-up in the Q&A. Thanks.
Okay. And as Michelle, as you brought that up, I see a few more questions from David, and I'll try to address those in the open Q&A at the end of the presentation. They're good questions, and I think I can address them for you. So I think personally, these are some tips for success. I think from an industry lens, if I had to remove myself and put myself in industry, it was kind of a cathartic effort in writing the slide, and said, okay, well, I'm going to be industry and not government, and try to look at it from an opposite lens. And that's healthy. I think that's good. The government should do that, because our industry partners are really what make our projects a success, by and large. I mean, we need that relationship to be sound, and we need to enable our industry partners to be able to be successful, because it makes us successful as well as the government. So sometimes we're our own worst enemy, and other times, each side of the equation has its challenges at times, but ultimately, I think by and large, the good outweighs the bad in most cases. So to me, I think from an industry perspective, you got to ask the critical questions. Don't assume that what's written on the paper is always the intent. And I know from a government side, which I'll talk about on the next slide, we do our best. Especially from the design construction agent community, we do our best to gather end user requirements. We really do, and there's always the one-off where it's just been complete havoc to kind of get any information out. But the intent, the spirit of intent, is we do try to give good end user requirements to put into our contractual requirements, so that the industry knows how to bid appropriately, to buy out this job, to bid this job out. But if something just does not look clear, ask, because many times the government may not know what they don't know, and sometimes it needs a spark from industry to ask a good question to go back and go, yeah, I think we really missed the mark on that. We need to give additional clarity. So there's no wrong in asking good questions. So some of those questions to ask, if you don't see it in narrative scopes of contracts, are these FRCSs, are they going to use common IP transport? And what I mean by that is, if you show up at an installation and and from the Army's perspective, if you have a netcom element, if they're using the shared netcom IP transport to connect their FRCSs to, Air Force, they have a community interest ICS network enclave that has its set of user requirements. The Navy, they have a platform enclave. So asking those types of, if it's not included in the narrative scope, understanding that kind of changes the relationship of how you're going to establish a design requirement, and then how it's intended to be installed downwind in construction. So if that's not in the scope, that's a question that I'd ask for clarification. Has the system owner and AO, have they been identified for the systems within the scope? And this gets really challenging by a project, and depending on the agency that you're constructing the project for, or designing the project for. In the Air Force, and I'll speak to the Army, which I have a lot more experience in, but in the Air Force, they have a community that handles physical security type and force protection that are separate from base CE, from the civil engineering side. So they have stipulated requirements that may have a different AO chain as opposed to base CE. So understanding all those critical stakeholders and who they are owned by and who those authorization officials are is not necessarily something you need to do the design per se, but knowing who they are up front in a planning charrette, if it's not included or if it's not stipulated by the government, just for background information, I think is a critical question to ask. Because if the government doesn't know, then the odds are of getting an impact are probably slim. That means it hasn't been defined. So as you're going to bid out that job, then you're concerned about, oh my gosh, well, I don't have the impact. Now, how am I going to execute the design from a timing and sequencing aspect? Is that going to push my schedule out because I'm waiting for the government? So ask that question, and I hate to say it as the government, but you have to bid accordingly. I mean, we understand that. And then there's dickering back and forth in terms of, is that a good bid? Is that a responsible bid? And going through and fleshing those things out. But those questions are really important to help you have a good bid and to have the government have assurance that we're getting a good, responsible bid on the back end. That follows into that impact rating. If the impact rating is not included, ask up front. And there's explicit direction in the UFC about the impact rating, and it kind of gives a triage of how the designer navigates that and gets to an impact rating if it's not provided. But I think by and large, the government has started to incorporate a lot of that narrative into their solicitations on some of the projects that I've seen. I know I've been pretty adamant to the community in saying, as we gather, project managers and project engineers, as we gather requirements from our stakeholders, the building owner from an industry perspective, ask that question at the charrette so that when we put these design RFPs on the street, we're giving some breadcrumbs to the industry so that they know that, yeah, we have a notional impact rating. So now I can bid appropriately, because if I don't have that, then I'm going to bid for worst case. And that, I mean, that's by and large in any technical discipline. If you don't have enough facts, then you got to hedge on the side of caution. I think another important question to ask is, and you may not have this up front in the bidding process, but it's good to ask, can't hurt to ask, is do any of these systems have a requirement to interconnect? So for example, if I'm putting in intelligent metering, does it have to interconnect to another system that maybe one of the services has that collects enterprise meter data? How do I tie into that? Do I need to tie into that? If I'm using that common transport, what requirements and what am I going to have to address or take into account from their user requirements? So interconnections are important because that changes the risk posture. That changes how the systems interoperate. Am I going to tie lighting control into the base-wide UMCS? Am I only keeping it at the building level? How does all that tie together? Am I taking occupancy sensors from a VAV and tying it into lighting? So I've got control for occupancy to turn lights on, turn lights off. Am I interconnecting systems? Those are important questions to ask, because it does, maybe not from a cyber perspective, but those requirements kind of intertwine. It gets really blurry on, is this a cyber requirement or is this a functionality requirement of the control system? And in most cases, it is both, because it has a domino effect, it has a ripple effect. Cross-reference the other divisions. Go through and make sure that when your mechanicals and electricals are reviewing requirements in a proposal or a spec or design guidance narrative, what's written in there, that the UMCS divisions, the 2309, the protocol, or in the 25 on the front end spec, if those conflict with what's written in the cyber spec, or there's conflicts amongst others, like that needs to be fleshed out. So if you see stuff that says, in the narrative that says the UMCS is going to operate on a standalone network, and then you see in the cyber side, well, it's going to connect to that, well, you've definitely got conflict right there. So look in those other divisions and make sure that they're, synchronized with each other and you don't have conflicts, because that can happen. The second thing, or the next thing that I discussed, and I said it early up front, is read and understand the terms and definitions within the UFC and UFGS. That is so important, I think, from an industry perspective, because a lot of the questions, answers to the questions are found in some of those definitions and understanding it. And if there needs to be guidance and direction on interpreting what those definitions, the intent, there's resources within the services to help you with that. I know the Navy has POCs. I can't cite them offhand, but they have teams that support that. I know the Air Force has I think it's not called the CMERT team anymore, but they have a team at AFCAC Tyndall that can assist with folks with determination of those definitions. And then, and within the Corps of Engineers, there's a Control System Cybersecurity Mandatory Center of Expertise that sits at Huntsville that can help discern those definitions or interpret, give a reading. Don't work in silos. Don't bring a cybersecurity professional onto your team and sit them over in a corner and say, just do the cyber spec, and not have them interface with a mechanical or electrical engineer that's doing other project specs. Have them work together as an integrated project team, because there are trade-offs, right? In that cyber person or IT professional, they need to understand it in totality, and likewise with the mechanicals and electricals, they need to understand collectively what the left and right hand are doing, because they do go and they do work together hand in glove. And as a designer, think beyond just cyber compliance. Think about how natively the systems are intended to function and work from a mechanical and electrical perspective that can ultimately limit cyber risk exposure. So, if there's requirements for redundancy and autonomous, putting things in hand HOA switches, those types of things that we have that are just salient mechanical and electrical features of the control system can ultimately kill two birds with one stone. So think how they're supposed to function and not so much on the network. The network is a big portion of an entry point to a control system, but it's not the end all be all. So think like a true designer and think from a different colored lens as you're going through executing a cyber design. Because a lot of the things that we're already doing natively in mechanical and electrical design for these control systems and how they function really truly address some of the cyber aspects. Then for the government, and I definitely want to leave time for question and answer, so I'm going to kind of push through this. Provide clarity and details to industry. A lot of this is the inverse of what was on the previous slide, but tell them what the communication medium is going to be. Even if it's assumed to be or proposed to be, that gives them something other than nothing, and it can be clarified as time goes on. And I know there's a mark where we have to get proposals and we have to award contracts. I get that, totally understand that. But any clarity and intent is vastly important up front versus after the fact, from a confidence of a good solid bid. And that's what change orders and things are throughout the contractual execution process are if we have uncertainties. But it's better to provide what you know than nothing on the front end of these contracts. I think it's vitally important as we start to go and execute and develop specifications. Define who all these stakeholders are. Think about it before it goes on the street. Like when you start the planning charrette or planning and programming, working with, developing 1391s or developing performance work statements that are non-MILCON type, work with your tenant, work with your stakeholder to gather that. And if they don't know, put that in the risk register. Put that as a circle back. We don't know now, we're moving on to the next phase, but come back to it and keep asking the question. It's just vitally important to have that information, because when you put that out on the street, if they have that information, it's just going to give the industry more confidence that they know the government has the right stakeholders aligned, and we're not going to have to delay to go figure all this stuff out post-award. Sure, things change, I get it, but it's vitally important to have as much as you can up front. And don't think of it as an afterthought in your planning and programming, and in your charrette level activities of putting these requirements out in the street. Be clear in the intent of scopes. Is the government purely asking for design? I put this on here. Is the government purely asking for design and construction services, like execute this building code, or is the scope more technical services for RMF support? Like I said, the Navy has a spec that does the follow-on RMF that the UFGS does not cover, and they have the ability to bring those services on. I know in my time within Engineering Support Center Huntsville, we do a lot of SRM work where there may be contract language that has those technical services stipulated out in an addendum to the P&I task. So, clearly define what you're asking them to do. Are you asking the contractor to execute the RMF or support the system owner in executing the RMF? Or are you just asking them to follow the building code? And if there's overlap on that, then really refine, strike out from one to the other, so you're going to get double billed in other sense, because the contractor doesn't understand they're going to have to account for it here and account for it there, because that's a risk to them. So it clearly have the intent of what you're asking for, and then back to those other divisions. Make sure that they don't contradict with what's being requested in Div 25. Government, you need to read and understand the definitions as well, because they're going to be coming back to you. Industry is going to come back to you for clarity on those. So just as vital as for industry to read those definitions and understand them and get interpretations on them, is equally important for the government as well to really understand them. Don't work in silos. This kind of goes back to having the cybersecurity professional work, closely in hand with the mechanicals and electricals and fire protection and physical security folks. Have them cross-pollinate, and have them understand how these design and construction processes work. Right? What is a submittal? How do we sequence a construction project? Because I think that's vitally important as well, because a lot of the folks in the cybersecurity realm, they're very smart and they're very sharp and they're very technical in terms of how to address cybersecurity. But if they don't understand the relevant environment they're going to do it within those constraints, you're not going to get an optimal product from the government. So government SMEs internally, and you're structuring your organizations and you're hiring and bringing contractor support on board, if that's one way of doing it, they've got to understand the relative environment of where they're applying these principles to, because there's a trade-off. There's a risk there. If everything looks like a nail, then everything gets a hammer, and sometimes that's not the case. So I think that's really important for the government, as they structure their organizations, that they understand the project management aspects of a design and construction project. They understand what submittals are, kind of a construction schedule. Those things are really important. So I highly suggest integrating your teams in that regard. And simple approaches to IT approaches, understand the differences between just pure IT and control systems. There's a lot. These are just a few. When you're working with control systems, sometimes you really have to modify the rules. You really do. You're operating in a gray area, because IT specifications that come out from NIST are, for the most part, and the RMF for the most part, are tailored towards specific business level IT systems. So, doing PKI infrastructure on a control system, that's a difficult thing to do. It really is. The industry is not up to par with that as opposed to the rest of the regular IT community. So, there are some trade-offs there. Keep IT solutions to IT systems. If you need remote access into a system, don't make the UMCS front end also the VPN gateway. Like, use traditional IT infrastructure to allow IT type functions to accommodate your control system. And then that second bullet, don't use the control system as your enterprise exchange server. Right? If you need an SMTP relay, coordinate with the IT people to get that SMTP relay so you can get alarms and alerts through email. You also have to assume maintenance dollars are limited and shared. So when we do the design, we really need to keep it simple. Give what is needed to perform, because the O&M side is fighting for the same dollars on a limited budget. So it's not a comprehensive IT solution. It's a control system, and those dollars are shared and tight. Non-approaches to cybersecurity: think about fail-safe modes of operation. That addresses some of the elements of cybersecurity. Don't rely on the network. If the control system can operate without having to be on an IP network, and that's what the project requires, then don't give me a Lamborghini when I'm asking for a Yugo. But also don't make that IP network the single point of failure. Don't be afraid to connect it if it needs to be, because there's a lot of things that can, the rewards of having connections for analytical platform. There's a lot of good benefits of connecting, but really, don't focus the control system on an IP network to be the single critical point of failure. Those systems need to be resilient within the building, without having that IP connectivity as an end-all be-all. Provide redundancy where needed, and really look at those manual overrides. So those are some of the things that are non-IT approaches to addressing cybersecurity, that I think a lot of us from the mechanical electrical fields, we really look at, and we understand that, but cybersecurity folks, well, we may not know, because we don't know what we don't know when it comes to mechanical and electrical design. So that concludes my presentation. I know there's some questions, and I know we've got about 5 or 6 minutes left to address them. So I'm going to stop there and turn it back to Michelle.
Awesome. So thank you very much. That was very helpful, Daniel. I think you definitely gave a deep dive and kind of dispelled some of the myths out there. I know from myself being in industry and as a manufacturer of some of these facility-related control systems, we got asked questions a lot, and this was very helpful. I wanted to start kind of, I guess, from the beginning. We've got Charlie that has a question here about the process. He works for a company that's a subsidiary and operating unit of the publicly traded large business. They specialize in Department of Defense construction for over 40 years. The cybersecurity specifications are driving up price, not only on our construction bids to the government, but also our overhead costs and how we operate our business to even qualify for being awarded DoD contracts. We're struggling to find qualified companies who can satisfy their requirements economically. Because this is a newer and commonly misunderstood scope element as related to construction contracts, the pricing is outrageously high and subcontractors' ability to satisfy DoD contracting officers is subpar. Where is a good source to solicit qualified cybersecurity engineering services subcontractors willing to work on DoD contracts?
Ooh, that's a good one. I wish I could tell you, here's the silver bullet like bucket of like highly qualified people that you can go to and fish from. I think unfortunately, I think the area of where you're doing operations, there's probably going to be a more preponderance of certain skills and expertise geographically. Like here in Huntsville, I don't want to say cybersecurity professionals are a dime a dozen. They're not by any stretch of the imagination, but there's a more concentration of those folks in the field because of just the defense sector here in town. I mean, we've got NASA, Redstone Arsenal. We've got a lot of high-tech things going on here in Huntsville. So there are a lot of folks in the field. I think the challenge that you mentioned, Charlie, which is a very poignant comment, is finding folks not only that have a cybersecurity background and knowledge set, but that can apply it to the paradigm of design and construction and related to control systems. So I have a really cool graphic that I've done in other presentations where we show like this big Venn diagram of like, here's IT professionals, here are control system cyber professionals, and here are people who understand both. And it just really whittles down to like almost non-existent. So I think your challenge is probably not much different than anyone else out in industry, is to find these people, and the government are alike. We're all struggling to find qualified people to really delve into this. This is kind of a new emerging technical field. And if you get on and you look at engineering record, or you look at a lot of other resources, and get on Indeed. That's something that I do just to monitor jobs and see how industry is. There are so many job opportunities out there for folks just in this field alone in the past 5 years that have ramped up. It is really truly a supply demand issue. So I wish I could tell you where to go, strategies to do, but I think it's really, really critical for folks in the design construction field to really look for JVs, look for joint partners, folks with a good quality background in this field, because it's growing. It's an emerging technical field, and it's probably, I don't want to use any big industry, but the big type design general contracting firms, to diversify and bring that talent on board is probably not where they need to be yet, but they're looking for partners to bring on for sure. So that's kind of how I would target it. It's a really targeted approach to bringing in that talent.
So next question comes from David. Is there an expectation that the facility-related control systems reside off the agency intranet and pretty much as a standalone system?
I think that is really incumbent of that stakeholder that the work is being performed for. I mean, they may have a prerogative to keep everything off. They may have a dedicated network. That's really just an end user requirement that we kind of have to solidify as we go through and, put our solicitations on the street. So I don't think there's any proposed intent per se to say keep them standalone, but there's not anything limiting it either from allowing it to occur. I think that's just an end user prerogative.
Okay. I know we're hitting 1 o'clock here, so I want to make sure we get this question in, and we'll stay on a little bit later to answer additional questions if you're able to. Sure. But Karen had mentioned, like Daniel, you mentioned an update coming out in May. will you provide guidance templates for the updated U5 250511 as you have for the current revision, specifically for the cybersecurity SME working with the GC? Cybersecurity subject matter expert. Sorry, my acronyms.
I think I understand that question. Let me, so in the updates, will we have a cybersecurity work with the GC? There is a section in the updated UFGS that that highlights if you need subject matter expertise to work in. It's kind of a designer. It's in designer brackets. Like if you need those hours, then you plug it in and do it. So that intent in the update hasn't changed. So it's still available in the pending spec that's going to be released. If that addresses it, I think it does. I'm not sure about the template piece. That's where I'm kind of scratching my head on. But if you have a different example, just shoot me an email and I'll try to address it.
Perfect. Just another question or two. In your experience with each agency, specifically Army, Navy, and Air Force, has an have an agency-wide RMF, or is it customized at more of the command or base level?
I think that's a it depends question. I know, like for Air Force, like physical for security force protection type systems, they have some service-wide ATOs for some of their force protection systems. That it's really work with the PMO to coordinate install. Like they already have that refined. In the Army, not so much. It's usually base by base by base. Or installation by installation. The Navy, they have some type authorized systems. I can't rattle them all off. I know they have Numix is one. So they have a Navy UMCS platform, I think is type authorized. And I may be speaking off base on that. Things have changed. I don't keep a tight pulse on the Navy as much as I should. But yeah, there are some, but more than often than not, they're typically installation by installation requirements.
Okay. And then last question, is a cybersecurity contractor who completes the documentation outlined in the completed 250511 specs during the build phase typically the same contractor who hardens the system? It is difficult to accurately bid hardening efforts for design build projects before system components, models, operating systems have been nailed down.
Yeah, so that in a design build paradigm, that is a challenge. So in a design build aspect, then I would assume, depending on how they execute that project, or how the GC selects who they're going to have to install and procure and do all those things, that the answer to that would be yes. They would be the same folks that are doing a lot of the hardening. Now, it depends on what area of the control system those things have, because there's a lot of other variables that go into that, I guess, that yes answer. Are you getting shared services from, that network communication provider? Are they going to provide switches, and who's doing what? So there are some kind of, like, if you want to call them racy actions, from provision of equipment into the facility, where, the design contractor, if it's design build, may not do. But in the new revised, I'm going to plug this for the UFGS update. In the new revised UFGS, there was a lot of focus and intent on giving pre-construction submittals of what do you see as the proposed STIGs that need to happen, that need to be applied to these systems based upon the design. And then as it refines, there's a post-construction submittal that says, tell me everything that you did provide, and then give me results to ensure that you did do what you said you needed to do. So it could be the same company that did it, or they could contract out someone else to bring them in and work side by side with the GC or the sub. It could be a sub to a sub that does that. I think means and methods of how it's done, it's so much variability in that to kind of do a definitive yes or no. But I think ultimately it's a yes, but it depends.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Daniel, for your time. I know this topic, it will continue to be a topic that is discussed as we're all kind of figuring out the dance between government, design, industry, manufacturing, all that stuff. Yep. So I really appreciate it. Tamel, we're going to take it back over to you.
Thank you for an excellent presentation, Daniel. It was well informative, great info in there. And thank you, Michelle, for stepping in and moderating today's session. I just want to remind everyone that in the handout section, you can find today's presentation and the PDH certificate. So if you go next to the polls tab in that handout section, it is ready to download. As far as our future upcoming events, we do have the major 2021 virtual JETC, which is held May 17th through the 21st. You can find all the information. Registration is open. So if you toggle on over there to the SAMEJETC.org webpage, you can find more information. And we will be sending out an email for future webinars for the ENS COI. So be on the lookout for that. Thank you again, both, and everyone have a great day.